We're now seriously into the Matthew section of the course, and as you can see from some of the piles of books down the front, there's no shortage of resources, as you probably discovered as you've been doing your first essay and then starting on your other essay. Some of the resources that I find most significant, most interesting to go into are the Hermaniah commentary on Matthew, a mere 3 volumes. You buy the book by the gram rather than by the page. But that's by Ulrich Lutz. I think has done a really substantial study on Matthew. Well, apart from anything else that's sitting there in front of you. But I think the content is also very good, very thoughtful. There's an earlier, also a 3-volume commentary set on Matthew in the ICC series with Allison and Davies, W.D. Davies and I think it's James Allison. And they're probably the 2 definitive technical commentaries on Matthew from the last couple of decades. And then, of course, there are lots of individual volumes looking at Matthew. And lots of monographs and short introductions, and there's no limit, of course, to the number of studies. So as we go through this sort of second part of the course, there'll be much more chance to really dig into some of the literature around Matthew. What we're doing today is, in a sense, something which, in a way, is better done at the end of the course, but inevitably we do it early, and it's what you sometimes find happening in the commentaries as well. Towards the end of an introduction section, you'll get a few pages on the key ideas or the major features and so on of the text, and it's helpful to have a bit of a sense of the forest before you get in amongst the trees and so on. But another level, being told in advance what are the big ideas in Matthew can mean they're the things you notice, and you don't necessarily notice some of the other things that are in Matthew because that provides a framework for a lens. So I'm a little bit sort of diffident to put too much emphasis on it, but it's an important part of the process to be aware that Matthew does have its own distinctive elements, both in terms of literary structure, literary features, its relationship with Mark, its use of Q, its attitude to Judaism, and so on. So there are some important things to note, but I hope we won't take them as sort of straitjackets that mean we can only hear Matthew through the lens of through the filter of those particular lenses. So let's go in and just explore some of the key aspects of Matthew's Gospel. Perhaps the first thing to notice is that Matthew is really, the new, improved, enlarged and revised edition of the Gospel we've all learned to love, namely the Gospel of Mark, if you think back to round about the turn of the 1st century. Mark's been around for 20 or 30 years or so by the time Matthew appears, and Matthew is a significant rewriting of Mark's Gospel. Now that means that whoever prepared Matthew's Gospel didn't feel that Mark really addressed the needs of their community, of their situation. Whether it's a community document or an individual character, this is somebody who felt we needed more than Mark. Mark was good as far as it went, but there was more to be said and more that needed to be said. And so 90% of Mark gets picked up and recycled to some extent in Matthew's Gospel. Yeah.
A community document, is there evidence of multiple authorship in that?
I think it would only be multiple authorship in the sense of the redactor has used material which may have had multiple hands in shaping it. And Lutz in particular will argue that some parts of the Sermon on the Mount, he sees the sermon, which is next week's topic, and indeed there's another commentary in the Hermaniah series thicker than the 3rd volume here, just on the Sermon on the Mount by Betz, top German scholar. Lutz's argument is that the Sermon on the Mount, while it's a Matthean construction, it has used some pre-worked and already constructed elements. In that case, you would get multiple authorship, but not multiple authorship in our modern sense of collaborative jointly authored kind of product. But the fact is you've got so much of Mark, and then Matthew's putting his own spin on it, possibly also using some other pre-existent material, which also includes Q, then you're hearing multiple voices being drawn into a collected kind of work. Compared with Matthew, Luke uses much less of Mark. Only just over half of Mark's gospel is recycled in Luke. So there's a significant adoption, take-up, albeit with modification, of the marker material in the Gospel of Matthew. And so Mark, in many ways, of course, is providing the basic story, but then if you're going to tell a sequential story of Jesus' public activity, it's going to have him starting out in the Galilee, and it's going to have him ending up in Jerusalem. And the ending up in Jerusalem is going to include a crucifixion and the process of betrayal and arrest and trial and so on. So the storyline, in big picture, the storyline is pretty predictable. But certainly in John's Gospel we find a very different kind of storyline, although it still ends up in Jerusalem with the crucifixion. What Matthew has done, of course, is to enlarge Mark, to add stuff at the beginning and the end, and also to insert into Mark a lot more teaching material, and most of that comes from what we call the Q Gospel. And in the process of doing that, Mark has had a significant revision, significant reshaping. Now, Powell, in his introduction to the New Testament, introducing the New Testament, he talks about some of the major ways in which Mark is reshaped. I just want to run through those briefly. He talks about marker material being reorganised, rearranged, being abbreviated, being sort of copy edited to improve the grammar and the syntax and the Greek style. Issues of accuracy being clarified and addressed, making the story more relevant to the context of Matthew's audience as distinct from Mark's audience. Not that we know for sure what the audience of either was, but there are some indications of change being done which might reflect context, and also some tweaking of the way different characters are represented in the text. Okay, so just to move through those reasonably quickly, because otherwise we'll just take forever to get through very little material. One example that Powell gives is that Matthew takes 5 miracle stories found in different parts of Mark's narrative and groups them together into chapters 8 and 9, along with some material from Q and some other material which is unique to Matthew. So the story of Jesus healing a leper from Mark chapter 1, the story of Jesus healing at a distance the son of an official, in this case the centurion's servant or child, is from Q, or Luke chapter 7, but Q. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law, again from Mark chapter 1, but earlier than the leper story. The healing of the demon-possessed character from Gadara, but now the character has been doubled, so there are 2 demoniacs, and that's a Matthean trait. He tends to double up some of the characters, including the sort of donkey that Jesus rides into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So he's quite a circus act. The healing of the paralysed man. Okay, this is the guy who in Mark is let down through the roof, but in Matthew there's no damage to the roof. The daughter of the synagogue healer being raised, which includes the episode in the middle with the healing of the woman with the long-term hemorrhage. The healing of 2 blind men, unique to Matthew, and the healing of a demoniac who's also mute or speechless. That's another story unique. So the point is that stories from different parts of Mark, chapter 1, chapter 5, chapter 2, have been gathered together by Matthew, rearranged into a larger set of stories about Jesus doing amazing stuff in chapters 8 and 9. Yeah, Karen.
Q is a lost document, isn't it? How do you know that it's chapter 7?
Okay. In order to talk meaningfully about Q, and again, there's a commentary in the Homania series on Q, which is not bad for a non-existent text. Okay, but the convention is you use the Lucan referencing for the Q material. So when we take Q7 it'll be material that occurs in Matthew 8 and in Luke 7, but we use the Lucan chapter and verse numbering to describe the cue. Otherwise, you've got to keep saying Matthew blah parallel Luke blah, so we just say Q7, Q11, well, that means Luke 11, and whatever passage in Matthew is the parallel to it. Yeah, no, good question. It's one of those things we probably dealt with, but it's, there's so much stuff going past you, it's easy to lose track, so it's good to say, hang on, how can we have a chapter and verse for a document that doesn't exist? Well, it's called scholarly imagination. No, it's called research. Okay, so one feature of the way Matthew uses Mark is that he's rearranged Mark. Okay. At the same time, even though he's using Mark, one of the characteristics of Matthew's way of using Mark is that he shortens the stories. He gives it a good edit and he cuts it back to just the basic story, and he leaves out a lot of the detail, makes the story less vivid, and sort of he's not interested in don't give me all that stuff. Just tell me the heart of the story, kind of thing. So, for example, although he's duplicated the suffering gentleman in the graveyard at Gadara, he leaves out references to the chains that he used to break and snap in his rages, and he leaves out other aspects of the guy's erratic behaviour. So the story is simplified, even though the number of characters has been duplicated. When it comes to the story of this paralysed man, he doesn't deal with the bit about smashing a hole in the roof, letting the mat down in front of where Jesus was standing. It's just Jesus saw the people bringing this guy to him, and so he deals with the situation. So the story is reduced, simplified, made less complex. Similarly, when dealing with that double story where Jesus is on his way to heal the daughter of Jairus, and he's interrupted by the woman who just wants to touch the hem of his garment, okay, then the reaction of the disciples and the response of the crowd is left out. So Matthew is simplifying the story, and these are just examples of that tendency in Matthew. So he's using Mark a great deal, but even though his overall gospel is longer, he's actually abbreviated Mark in the process of rearranging and revising him. At the same time, like a good copy editor, he's working through Mark's grammar and improving his Greek. So Mark might have struggled to pass New Testament Greek, but Matthew is a good solid sort of credit or distinction. He's going to do a better job of the Greek. So, for example, 130 of the 150 historical present instances in Mark are changed to more appropriate tenses that actually use the past tense for an event in the past rather than everything being in the present continuous. And he's walking along and he sees these fishermen and he says to them, and they leave their nets and they follow him, and it's all in the present tense. It's like a child speaking who doesn't have a good grasp of syntax and grammar. And so Matthew improves the grammatical structure. Now that's partly perhaps his own, I just can't stand that. It's like me marking essays and they're sort of split infinitives and I just have to kind of identify them for you because I'm helpful like that. So it may just be Matthew's, like fingernails on a blackboard kind of thing, or it may also be out of concern for his audience that expected a higher level of oral and written Greek communication. So there's much less use of kai and euthus. So again, if you looked at Mark, you'll know he quite often just says, and straight away and immediately and immediately and immediately, and it's like, Jesus is running around doing one thing after another. And it's all very simple, just stringing episodes together with simple conjunctions. Matthew provides much more appropriate transitions and introductions to his episodes. And where the pronouns lack clear antecedents, he makes sure that it's clear who the person is that's speaking or acting in a particular sentence. So generally speaking, he improves the syntax and the quality of the Greek. There are some cases where Mark simply makes mistakes. Okay, and that's not an issue for many of us, but because people have a very high view of inspiration, a very high view of Scripture, it's a wee problem that the Gospel of Mark has mistakes in it, misquotes the Bible, that sort of thing. You'd think, those things wouldn't happen if you have a particular view of inspiration. So, for instance, where Mark garbles and says, this happened to fulfill what was written in the prophet Isaiah, and then quotes from quotes from Malachi. So I just did the same thing. Before introducing a quotation from Isaiah, and there are various textual variants where ancient scribes have tried to fix that problem. Matthew fixes it by dropping the passage from the book of Malachi. So it is actually a quote from Isaiah, not a hybrid quote from Malachi and Isaiah. So he just tidies up the little mistake there. In Mark chapter 6, there's a reference to King Herod, which would have made Antipas very happy because he wanted everybody to think of him as King Herod, and clearly Mark has bought that spin, but in fact Matthew correctly says Herod Antipas. He's not King Herod. Okay? He wanted the dynastic title Herod, but he didn't receive it until much later when his coins begin to use it. Similarly, there's a reference in Mark chapter 12 to Abiathar being the high priest in the time of David, and he wasn't, which is clear from 1 Samuel 21. And so Matthew tidies that up. Now, all that's saying is whoever is producing this updated version of Mark that we call Matthew, pays more attention to detail, is more concerned about accuracy, he's more literary, he's more a textual person, whereas Mark might be more in the genre of oral communication. Okay, and that the primary mode of Mark's gospel may be oral performance, whereas the primary mode of Matthew is a document, is a text. So we're getting more care, more accuracy as the information is being transmitted. Again, another one in the story of the so-called rich young man, rich young ruler. Okay, and again, he's not a rich young ruler in all three versions of the story. Okay, he's young in Matthew, and he's a ruler in Luke, and he's rich in all three. So in our Sunday school curricula, he's become the rich young ruler because we've blended the three stories and come up with a hybrid characterization. Okay, he's a rich young man in Matthew. Okay, and he's a rich ruler, a despotes in Luke, and he's a rich man in Mark. Now, unless Jesus constantly had rich people running up, kneeling down and asking exactly the same question and getting more or less the same answer in exactly the same sequence of phrases, this is probably the one story, okay, that's been given to us by Mark, and Matthew and Luke have modified it. And Matthew has introduced the idea of being a young disciple, and Luke has given the story the spin of addressing the ruling classes, because that's his audience, Theophilus. Okay? But at the beginning of that story, in Mark and also in Luke, the rich person says to says to Jesus, "What must I do to be saved?" And Jesus' response is, "What must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus' response is, "Why do you call me good? There is nobody good but God." And Matthew changes that to, "Why do you ask me about what is good? Only God is good." Okay, so Matthew has just alleviated a potential embarrassment that Jesus is saying, "Don't confuse me with God," in Mark and Luke, and Matthew's rearranged it so that Jesus is not saying that any longer. Okay, so just resolving a kind of theological ambiguity. Then there's the question of, is Matthew perhaps in some of his editorial changes not simply making it nicer, more accurate, more fancy, but is he also adapting things to meet the needs of his own audience? And so, for instance, where Mark will sometimes explain a Jewish custom, Matthew doesn't do that. Is that because his readers are more aware of Jewish customs, that it would be redundant to include it? Okay? Now, in some ways these are questions more than answers, but it's all part of a package of getting a fix on Matthew. Similarly, almost always, but not entirely consistently, where Mark will have the kingdom of God, Matthew will have the kingdom of heaven. Okay? And that's usually understood as reflecting Jewish diffidence about using Hashem, as we heard in the morning in the reading, Old Testament reading this morning. If you avoid using the name Hashem of God, whether it's Yahweh or even God, then you're less likely to accidentally blaspheme. So there's a Jewish diffidence about, mentioning God's name or even the word God. So, for instance, in the Lord's Prayer, in Luke's version, it's Father, Abba. Okay? But in Matthew, it's our Father who is in heaven. A much more polite, ambiguous, reverent kind of approach. So this could be a change, and most people see it as a change that reflects Jewish cultural, religious sensitivities. Number of places where he takes over material from Mark. Matthew upgrades villages, the Kome, to a polis, to a city. Now, polis is a very different political, that's the same word, that's where it comes from, entity with to do with scale and rights and sort of autonomy and so on. So, so there's a kind of upgrading of, instead of this is like village stuff, it becomes town stuff, becomes city stuff, more urban lifestyle.
Just wondering that the doubling, is that part of this as well? Like, is Matthew just like got a fisherman's problem, like making it...
The fish gets bigger. Well, he was a tax collector, so perhaps his assessment profile grew as he spent longer at your dinner table. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, or is it simply that because he's writing, or this text is being prepared and used in a sort of urban Greek environment, which is still very Jewish, but is an urban environment like Antioch, that they just naturally, they no longer talk about villages because we're all city people now. And there's just a kind of a shift of register from one key to another. So the context for Jesus moves from the rural ambience of the village to the city, because that's where the followers of Jesus are going to be found at the beginning of the 2nd century. Remember, the word pagan originally meant country person. And Pagani were the country folk, the farmers. And the Christians were not pagans, the Christians were townies. Okay? Things have changed. And this is just one item, I guess that's another example of that. Whereas Jesus tells the disciples not to take any coppers with them, in Matthew, Jesus tells them not to take any copper or silver or gold. So their travelling expense account has got a bit more generous. Okay, now, behind that is the reality that even in the time of Herod the Great, he only ever minted copper coins. The little tiny ones I was passing around a couple of weeks ago, okay? Prutot. And that's equally the case for Antipas and for Philip. The coins minted and also the coins minted by Pontius Pilate and so on. The coins minted in Palestine in the 1st century were copper coins. Silver coins were only minted at the big mints up in Phoenicia, like Akko and Tyre in particular, and Athens and Damascus and Antioch. Okay, and gold coins were only minted in Rome, nowhere else in the empire. Okay, so to drop in, don't just talk about copper coins. For the conversation to drift into the arena of talking about silver and gold coins, again, you've moved from a fairly non-monetized rural agricultural context into a more urban mercantile context, where silver and gold were just part of the conversation. Now, that makes very interesting Peter's comment to the paralysed man in the temple in Acts chapter 4 or whatever. Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I you. Yeah, that sort of thing. Okay? Of course he didn't have silver and gold. He was a fisherman from Galilee. They never had silver and gold. Okay? So maybe that's Luke's more wealthy, affluent perspective coming into the storytelling. These are all the little things, because we don't... Once upon a time, in the ancient world, this was just stuff people knew, but now we have to kind of intentionally kind of bring the information to bear on our reading, because there are all these little hints that Matthew is a slightly more better resourced community of Christians than Mark is perhaps addressing with his version. So he's based on Mark, but he's taken Mark to a different place, to a different social location. Okay? Character portrayal, just very quickly. You can read into the details if you go back into Mark Powell's introduction. A whole lot of things about Jesus gets a bit of a workover. Okay, the PR advisor has come in to help. So anything in any sort of questions being asked by people in Mark that imply that Jesus didn't know everything, they just get left out. Okay, delete that bit from the manuscript. Okay, any statements that imply Jesus didn't have the ability or the authority to do something gets dropped out. For instance, Mark chapter 6. Jesus having a rough day back in his hometown. Mark says he wasn't able to perform any miracles there because of their lack of faith, except that he healed a few people and cast out a couple of demons. Well, that's not bad for a day's work in your hometown, but basically he really wasn't having a great day on the job like he does at Capernaum. Well, Matthew, of course, eliminates that. Nothing which will reflect badly on Jesus' CV. Whereas in Mark, he's angry, grumpy, teary, tired. No, he never loses his cool in Matthew. Okay, he never has a human emotion. He's just always very even. And any stories which might suggest Jesus was in some sense a magician, well, they can get cut out as well. We don't take that material across. All right. So Jesus is getting his character is being cleaned up in the way that Matthew wants to present him. Has no flaws. Okay, this is the lead into an election, to the launch of a campaign. Okay, the perfect spin. The disciples are also getting a bit of a clean-up. Whereas Matthew has Jesus criticise them because they have no faith, in Matthew they become people of little faith, which is an improvement. Okay, where in Mark they don't understand, they just don't get Jesus. Do you not understand? In Mark, in Matthew, how come you're so slow to understand? It's just a gentle, a modification of the criticism. The case of James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, they don't want promotion. It's their mother who wants them to be promoted. Okay, the Jewish mum wants her boys to do well in the new business. Okay, it's always the women. All right, and of course the disciples are sometimes described as worshipping Jesus and addressing him as Kyrios, and Kyrios is yes, it's the word for sir, but it's also the word used in the Septuagint to represent Yahweh. Okay, so there's an ambiguity about Jesus being addressed with the language which Jewish Greek-speaking Jews would use for God. As for the Jewish leaders themselves, they're consistently represented as hostile to Jesus and more hostile than they are in Mark. So for instance, in Mark 22, there's a scribe or a Pharisee who's actually complimenting Jesus. He gets cut out of the story, thank you very much. We don't want any scribes or Pharisees actually showing that they're on side, because they're the other by now. Or in the case of a couple of named characters like Joseph of Arimathea and so on, the fact that they're religious leaders in the Jewish community, that bit is omitted and we just get their name but not their Jewish role. Now, we tend not to notice that because we know that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council, but Matthew just drops that out so that we're not making those connections. Okay? Of course, had Matthew had to put his text through Turnitin, he might have had a bit of problem getting his essay accepted. Okay, so there's some of the features that we're dealing with in terms of Matthew's use of Mark. In terms of the finished product itself, what are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with a text which is Jewish, as indeed all the Gospels are. I mean, all the New Testament texts are written by Jewish people. Possible exception being Luke and Acts, which may or may not have been written by a Jewish person, but even the majority of people, in fact, who think Luke was not raised Jewish tend to think of Luke as having been a proselyte, having been converted to Judaism prior to becoming a Christian, because he's so grounded in the Septuagint. But that can also be explained by having Luke as a 2nd century person, where the Greek Bible was a very important part of early Christian catechesis. So all the Gospels are Jewish, but Matthew is the most deeply Jewish. It's the Gospel that resonates most with themes and motifs and interests which are core and distinctive elements for Jewish identity. So in some ways, in Matthew, Jesus is a Jewish rabbi. Okay? And he acts as a kind of interpreter of the law, and it seems to be a number of points where Jesus is being cast in the role of a new Moses. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount, where he goes up a mountain and reveals God's new requirements, a bit like the Sinai story in a kind of a way. But actually in the first couple of chapters of Matthew, his infancy story, there are a lot of echoes of what's called the Moses Haggadah. Now the Moses Haggadah, Haggadah means a story. Okay, and so the Passover Haggadah is the story that goes with the Passover celebration. Okay, not the Seder, not the liturgy, and not the halakha, which are the instructions, but the stories, the sacred stories, the legends. And so the Moses Haggadah is reflected in some of the writings of, say, Philo of Alexandria and so on, and we can reconstruct some of the forms in which Jewish people were telling stories about Moses and elaborating, expanding on the Exodus story, which is a good story, but it doesn't give you all the details. Like, how do you go from a basket in the Nile to being Prince of Egypt? Well, there's plenty of scope there for folk tales and other things to enrich the story, and all the trials and tribulations that Moses must have gone through as part of that process. Okay, so it seems that what Matthew is doing in his infancy narrative is to cast Jesus in the robes of Moses. Okay, and of course has to be rescued from the nasty king who's trying to kill all the baby boys, just like Moses had to be rescued, and so on. Okay. So both the content and the tone, the atmosphere of Matthew's Gospel reflects Jewish ambience in a way that's not so much the case for Mark and Luke and John. And at the same time, and not inconsistently, the hostility or the argument, the dispute with rival Jewish leaders, seen especially in chapter 23, is the most vicious of any of the Gospels. But that also goes with a dispute or a document or an expression of Christianity which is very Jewish but is wrestling with issues of inclusion and exclusion. And so the boundary issues and the internal conflict is much more fierce. And I resisted saying 3 Jews, 4 opinions, but it's that sort of rigorous debate which is part of Jewish identity as well. So it's not anti-Jewish to have really vicious criticism of your internal opponents, even though when it gets picked up by Gentiles in a different situation, it becomes anti-Semitic. It's like the police interfering with a domestic dispute and then find that the victim of the domestic dispute sides with her husband and attacks the police officer. It's one thing for the husband and wife to be disagreeing, it's another thing for a neighbour to intervene, and so it gets a bit trickier. So let's look at issues around structure in terms of literary features. It's clear that in taking over Mark, Matthew has imposed a new structure. However, it's not exactly clear what the structure is. I mean, how do we articulate the structure that Matthew is using? The most obvious change, I guess, is the infancy narrative, but the most significant change are these 5 blocks of teaching material, discourses, the 5 speeches or the 5 sermons. The Sermon on the Mount, basically chapters 5, 6, 7, the mission discourse in chapter 10, the parables discourse in chapter 13, community discourse in chapter 18, and the eschatological discourse, chapters 24 and 25. Yeah.
What's the velocity of those? How would those have been used in Matthew's community?
Well, Lutz's argument is that the really significant thing about this discourses is this is when Jesus addresses the reader directly. Okay? Whereas the rest of the Gospels, you get stories about Jesus, what he was doing back there with them. But in the discourses, Jesus is speaking directly to the audience of the Gospel writer. So when we experience the Sermon on the Mount, it's addressed to us. It's not overhearing what Jesus is saying to the fishermen or to somebody else. These are the times when Jesus, and it is said, steps outside of the Gospel and becomes the teacher in the audience, in the world in front of the text. And I'll probably come back to that a bit later, but that's part of, I think, what's going on here. I mean, a similar question would be in John's Gospel. It's all discourses, basically, very little narrative. And so the primary transaction is between the reader and the teacher, not us observing Jesus having a conversation with Nicodemus, but it's what is Jesus saying to me as I read or hear that text. So the discourse genre allows a different kind of communication with the reader than telling a report about something Jesus said or a report about something Jesus did. Okay, so I think that's partly what's going on. So we've got the 5 discourses. Each of them are followed by a little transitional formula that then says, okay, well, that's all very well now. Having said that, Jesus went on to do da-da-da-da-da. So that kind of lets us see there's a intentional transition from the discourse back into the narrative. Everybody, of course, at least for the last couple of 100 years, has commented on 5 books, 5 books of Moses. Something's going on here. 5, and the Psalms are grouped into 5 unequal books. And if you look at the way the Septuagint was organised as well, there are 5 sections in the Tanakh and so on. So this idea of 5 is probably a reference, a reflection of the significance of Torah. But Matthew is not structured in any way that really directly parallels the Torah. Okay, but there are hints. And probably the Sermon on the Mount is really the only part of Matthew where Jesus could be imagined as delivering a new Torah. Okay, he's doing a Moses. The other 4 discourses are entirely different. So the idea of 5 probably has a canonical significance, but it's pushing it too far to say Matthew is intended to be a 5-volume or a 5-part sacred text. So the Moses legacy is a deeper level than simply the 5 discourses. And I've already mentioned the Moses Haggadah, which appears to underlie some of chapters 1 to 2, but more importantly, the way Jesus is consistently represented as the great, ultimate, supreme interpreter of Torah. Indeed, his words can override and replace Torah. You have heard it said, but I'm telling you. Okay, now in every case, he's not diminishing Torah. He's not overturning Torah. He's actually upgrading the requirements and making it tougher. And that's a different take on Jesus. Okay? And Paul might have disagreed, one imagines, with where Matthew's coming from. Okay? And so what Lutz, as I mentioned before, what Lutz is suggesting is that it's in the discourses in particular that the readers of Matthew kind of encounter Jesus directly. This is direct communication from the risen Lord present in the community speaking to them. He's no longer sitting on a mountaintop in the Galilee. He's speaking to them in Antioch or wherever. So one very simple structure, and a number of people have suggested this and pointed it out as an option, is to simply pick up the 2 transitional formulas 4:17, 16:21, where it says, from that time Jesus began to do such and such. And if you structure the whole of the gospel that way, then you have an introduction which goes partway through chapter 4, and then the rest of chapter 4 through to the middle part of chapter 16 is Jesus' ministry to and within Israel, and then for the rest of the book it's Jesus moving to Jerusalem to die and to rise in Jerusalem. So it's a very simple way of structuring the text, and it's trying to pay attention to clues within the text, but we're going to see that's a bit trickier than we might otherwise imagine. A different model is to say, and this I think is the model that Puskas and Crump prefer, is to note that there's this alternating sequence between narrative discourse as you go through. So chapters 1 to 4, stories about Jesus. 5, 6, 7, discourse, Sermon on Mount. 8 and 9, Jesus out there doing stuff, healing people, casting out demons. Chapter 10, the disciples sent out to do the same thing, the mission discourse. 11 and 12, Jesus out doing stuff, getting involved in controversy and so on. And then chapter 13, the discourse on parables and so on. Okay? So you can follow this through. And the final lot of narratives is of course, the sort of passion narrative in 26, 27, 28 with the Easter appearances. And then there's no discourse unless you take the last scene, which is Jesus appearing on a mountain in Galilee and saying, all authority on heaven and earth is given to me. Go and make disciples, but teach them to observe all things, baptize them, da-da-da-da-da. So possibly verses 16 to 20 are just the little discourse that wraps up the gospel, and it's the discourse of the Great Commission. Okay? But most people would just see 26 to 28 as narrative. I'm just raising the possibility maybe the last episode is kind of the little micro discourse that ends the gospel. And it's certainly the climax of the gospel. Everything in Matthew leads to that moment at the end where Jesus says, well, that's it, guys, I'm in charge and here are your marching orders. So it's certainly the climax of the gospel. The other thing is, I remember a few weeks ago we looked at the work by Richard Burridge, who's arguing that the genre for understanding the Gospels is biography. Well, if that's the case, then the sort of biographical genre should give us some sense of the structure. And this only added this in this morning after chapel, so this is not in the handout. Okay, but it occurred to me, hang on, if we're doing all this stuff about structure, surely if the basic genre is that we're dealing with biography, then that has to affect the structure of Matthew's gospel as well. How does Matthew do that? Now, part of the problem for us is that Matthew is actually incredibly complex, and he gives us so many potential organisational markers that we're not sure which are signs and which are just decorations. Okay? So, and what we've got here, I guess, is a version of the narrative discourse structure, but put within the genre of biography. And recognising that in the genre of an ancient biography, there are some things you have to deal with, because it was significant to tell stories about remarkable omens around the time of the person's conception, birth or childhood, because that marked out somebody who was destined for great things. You wanted to pay particular attention to how the guy died, because that's when you saw his true character. And of course you want to know what his reputation, what his public career was made up of. And so for Matthew, that's the central material. He's talking about Jesus, the great teacher, the healer, the one who is bringing God among us and causing conflict within Israel. So just factoring that into our discussion.